In the smoke-choked skies of World War II, the air was more than a battlefield. It was a proving ground for courage, pride, and survival. Among the many legends that rose from those violent years, none shone brighter or more defiantly than the story of the Red Tails, the Tuskegee Airmen, America's first all-black fighter pilots. To the German Luftwaffe, these men were little more than a rumor at first, a whispered curiosity, dismissed as propaganda. How, they thought, could men who had been denied equality on the ground possibly challenge the Reich's most seasoned pilots in the air? But by the end of the war, the name Red Tails struck fear into the hearts of even the most decorated German aces. It began in 1944, when the skies over Europe belonged to the Luftwaffe. German pilots, trained since boyhood and fueled by ideology, had earned reputations as ruthless hunters. The Allies, desperate to push deeper into occupied territory, needed bomber escorts who could stand toe-to-toe with the best. Out of Alabama's Tuskegee Institute came a squadron of young black men, many of them sons of farmers, teachers, and mechanics, determined to prove that their skill was not limited by the color of their skin. They flew P-51 Mustangs, sleek silver machines marked by bright red tails, a symbol of their unity and pride. At first, German pilots laughed when they saw those crimson streaks cutting across the horizon. They believed it would be easy, that untested American pilots would panic and break formation. But they were wrong. The Red Tails flew differently, disciplined, calm, and fiercely loyal to their mission. They never left their bombers unguarded, earning the admiration of both American crews and enemies alike. Each mission brought new victories, and soon the laughter faded into disbelief. Reports began to circulate among Luftwaffe squadrons. These red-tailed Mustangs, they do not miss. By the spring of 1945, the Red Tails had rewritten the rules of aerial warfare. They racked up more than 100 confirmed kills, downing some of Germany's most advanced fighters, including the feared Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf 190. German pilots who once mocked them now avoided engaging whenever they spotted red tails in the distance. The myth of superiority, the idea that the Luftwaffe ruled the sky, had been shattered by men who were fighting two wars at once. One against fascism abroad and another against racism at home. This is the story of how arrogance turned to awe, how doubt became defeat, and how a squadron of underestimated men changed the course of air combat forever. German pilots didn't believe in the Red Tails, then regretted it after 100 kills is not just a tale of battles and victories, it's a story of redemption, unity, and unyielding spirit. In every burst of gunfire and every cloud of smoke, the Red Tails proved one timeless truth. Courage knows no color, and legends are born from belief, not privilege. The winter air over occupied Europe in 1944 carried a sharp edge, one that sliced through even the thick leather of a Luftwaffe pilot's jacket. To many German airmen stationed at the various fields stretching from northern France to Austria, the war in the skies had become a contest of fatigue and fading faith. They still flew with pride, still saluted the Black Cross on their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, but deep within, the certainty of their superiority had begun to crack. For years they had ruled the air. For years they had been told the Reich's pilots were unmatched, that no foreign force could match the precision of the Luftwaffe. Yet as the Allies grew stronger and their machines faster, whispers began circulating among the officers' mess halls and smoke-filled bunkers, rumors of a new enemy squadron, unlike any they had faced before. Some called them the Red-Tailed Devils. Others mocked them as a propaganda trick. Black pilots flying American planes? Impossible, they said. Americans may let them sweep floors, one pilot laughed bitterly, but they don't let them fly. The laughter hid a quiet nervousness. The war was changing, and every new rumor came with a hint of unease. The 332nd Fighter Group, known later to history as the Tuskegee Airmen, was cutting a path through the European skies, and their crimson-tailed P-51 Mustangs had become symbols of discipline, courage, and something the Germans hadn't yet understood: resolve born from being underestimated. But at this point in the story, to the German pilots sitting in the frozen mess halls of Bavaria, the Red Tails were still a myth, a story told by captured soldiers who swore they'd seen black pilots in dogfights over Italy. Commanders dismissed such reports as nonsense. "Neger fliegen keine Flugzeuge," said one colonel. "Negroes don't fly airplanes." His voice carried both arrogance and the echo of indoctrination. Yet the myth was about to become real, and that arrogance would soon be burned away in fiery and aluminum. The first encounter came on a morning layered with fog. German pilots of Jagdgeschwader 53, the pick-ass squadron, were scrambled to intercept a formation of American bombers heading toward Munich. The early warning radar showed heavy escort, likely P-51s. Major Franz Keller, a veteran of over 60 victories, tightened his gloves as he climbed into his Messerschmitt Bf 109. "Same game as always," he muttered to his wingman. "Hit the bombers, break the escorts, go home." His confidence came from years of dominance, from believing the enemy was always predictable. As the engines roared and the planes lifted off the tarmac, none of them knew that today's escorts were not the usual white-faced Ivy League boys of the U.S. Air Army Air Forces, but men from Alabama, Chicago, and Harlem whose lives had been a constant battle long before the war. At 20,000 feet, the battle began. Keller's formation spotted the distant glint of silver, the B-17s, and angled upward, ready to cut through them like wolves through sheep. Then, like streaks of flame, 6 red-tailed Mustangs broke formation from above. They moved with surgical precision, their formations tight, their discipline flawless. Keller noticed immediately these weren't amateurs. He radioed his squadron, "Achtung, Red Tails, 6 Uhr oben." The sky erupted. Keller dove, firing short bursts from his MG-131 cannons, but the Mustangs weaved and rolled with unnerving control. One of them, later identified as flown by Lieutenant Charles "Chuck" Harmon, pulled an impossible climb, looping behind Keller's wingman and slicing his tail in half with a burst of .50 caliber fire. The German's plane disintegrated before Keller's eyes. For the first time, he felt something unfamiliar in his gut: doubt. As the dogfight continued, Keller's radio was alive with panic. "Sie sind überall," his pilot shouted. "They're everywhere." The Red Tails moved in coordinated pairs, covering one another, refusing to abandon the bombers. Their code was simple: protect the heavies at all costs. And they did. Every German pass was met with fierce resistance, every dive countered by precise retaliation. When Keller finally broke through the chaos to line up on a bomber, another Mustang appeared out of nowhere, forcing him to dive out of formation. When he landed back at base, his fuel nearly gone, his knuckles white on the stick, he said only one sentence to his mechanic: "These Americans, they fight like ghosts." That night, in the dimly lit hangar, talk spread quickly among the squadron. Pilots who survived the sortie described the strange Red Tails, the incredible discipline, the feeling that the enemy had somehow evolved overnight. Keller tried to calm his men, reminding them that superior skill and strategy would always prevail, but even he couldn't shake the image of that red flash in his mirror. The next morning, intelligence confirmed what the men had whispered. Reports from other sectors described similar encounters. Red Tails escorting bombers over Italy, Austria, even Berlin. A new unit, small but deadly. "Impossible," Keller said again, but the word sounded hollow now. Meanwhile, in the Allied bases across the Mediterranean, the Tuskegee Airmen were just beginning to feel the weight of their growing legend. They knew what was said about them by both enemies and supposed allies. They knew that many white officers doubted their abilities, that the newspapers back home barely mentioned their victories. But in the air, none of that mattered. Every German fighter shot down, every bomber that made it home, was proof, not just of their skill, but of their worth. Captain Daniel "Lucky" Lewis, one of the most daring red-tail pilots, often told his men before takeoff, "Let them underestimate us. That's how we win twice." His voice was calm, but carried the fire of a man who had lived through insult and still soared above it. On the ground, the Americans were celebrating another mission with 0 bomber losses, a record that baffled even the high command. But for the Germans, the psychological blow was severe. In Berlin, reports reached the Luftwaffe High Command describing exceptionally skilled Negro pilots flying advanced P-51 Mustangs. General Galland, a legendary ace himself, read the report with skepticism but took it seriously. "If it's true," he said, "then the Americans have done something remarkable, not in machines, but in men." The German propaganda machine tried to suppress such reports. It didn't fit the narrative of racial superiority that fueled the Reich's ideology. But among the pilots on the front lines, truth mattered more than politics, and the truth was clear. These red tails were not to be taken lightly. As winter deepened, the air war intensified. The Battle of the Bulge raged below, and both sides fought desperately for control of the skies. Keller and his men were assigned to intercept yet another bomber stream, this time near Salzburg. They flew into the frigid morning sun, hoping to surprise the Americans. But the red tails were already waiting. The sky turned into a deadly dance of smoke trails and sunlight flashes. Keller tried every maneuver he knew, but the Mustangs matched him move for move. One dove past his wing and climbed in a perfect vertical roll, a move so precise Keller almost forgot to fire. He realized too late that he wasn't fighting machines anymore. He was fighting minds trained to perfection, men who had transformed adversity into an art form of survival. When Keller's plane finally took a burst to the fuselage, he ejected, landing hard in the snow. From the ground, he looked up at the battle, a formation of B-17s gliding safely westward, flanked by red tails glinting in the pale sun. For a long time, he didn't move. Around him, the silence of the forest was broken only by the distant hum of engines fading into the horizon. Later, when he was rescued by his unit, he said quietly, "They don't fight like the others. They fight as if they have something to prove, and they always do." In the weeks that followed, the legend of the Red Tails spread across the European front. German pilots began to identify the crimson paint immediately, and their hearts sunk when they saw it. Every encounter left their squadrons thinner, their confidence weaker. Some still refused to believe the truth, insisting it must be American trickery, that no black pilot could fly with such mastery. But deep down, even the most arrogant aces began to accept what pride had long denied. The Red Tails were real, and they were rewriting the laws of air combat. Snow melted into slush along the airstrips of southern Germany, yet the chill in the air carried something heavier than winter, the slow erosion of invincibility. Among the Luftwaffe pilots, whispers had grown into uneasy talk, spreading through every mess hall and officer's tent. The Red Tails. Their name now carried weight, not as a rumor or propaganda myth, but as a force that even the most seasoned German pilots began to fear. Major Franz Keller had survived their first encounter, but it had left scars he could not easily conceal. He replayed the fight in his mind, over and over. The disciplined movement, the perfect timing, the eerie precision. The enemy had been relentless, yet calm, and there was no arrogance in their aggression, only purpose. That was what haunted him most. They didn't fight for glory. They fought to prove something. And that made them unstoppable. Keller sat inside a dimly lit hangar, his gloved hands tracing the edge of a bullet hole in his Messerschmitt's fuselage. Around him, mechanics worked in silence, patching up planes that had barely crawled home from another mission. His adjutant, Lieutenant Otto Weiss, approached cautiously, holding a report. "Another unit was hit near Linz," he said. "Red-tailed P-51s again. They lost 6 of our aircraft, no bomber losses reported." Keller looked up, his jaw tightening. "6?" Weiss nodded. "And the survivors say they fly like machines, tight, cold, perfect." Keller smirked bitterly. "No, Otto, machines make mistakes, these men don't." That same morning, hundreds of miles south, at an Allied base in Ramatelli, Italy, the 332nd Fighter Group was preparing for another bomber escort mission. Captain Daniel Lucky Lewis stood beside his crimson Mustang, checking the oil pressure as ground crewmen loaded ammunition belts into the wings. Around him, laughter and radio chatter filled the air. The men of the Red Tails had grown used to their legend, yet they bore it quietly, knowing that each victory was hard-earned, each mission another test of faith. Lewis adjusted his goggles and turned to his wingman, Lieutenant Harmon, the same pilot who had downed Keller's wingman weeks earlier. "They'll be waiting for us today," Lewis said. "They've studied us now. They'll come hard." Harmon grinned, his eyes gleaming behind dark lenses. "Then we'll come harder." The mission brief was simple, but dangerous. Escort a group of B-17 flying fortresses over enemy supply depots near Munich, deep inside German airspace. Intelligence reports warned of heavy Luftwaffe presence, including elite aces from JG-53 and JG-77. It was the kind of challenge the Red Tails lived for, not just to protect the bombers, but to prove once again that their reputation wasn't built on luck. As the Mustangs lined up for takeoff, their red tails shimmered under the cold morning sun like blood against silver. The engines roared, and one by one they lifted into the vast blue. Above the clouds, the bomber formation looked majestic, rows of silver giants droning steadily, their vapor trails cutting through the sky like scars. The red tails flew tight around them, each man in perfect sync. Lewis's voice crackled through the radio. "Stay sharp, eyes on your sectors, they'll hit fast." His men replied with clipped affirmations. Hours passed in tense silence until radar operators called in bogies. Enemy aircraft approaching from the northeast. The Germans were coming. Keller led his unit, his heart pounding but his mind clear. The arrogance that once fueled his flying had burned away, now only survival and vengeance remained. He remembered the humiliation, the disbelief that colored the earlier encounters. Today, he told himself, would be different. We strike in pairs, no lone wolves, no glory, just kills. Aim for the bombers, the escorts will follow. His men acknowledged, and the horizon ahead shimmered with sunlight. Then the red flashes appeared. 16 P-51s, their tails bright crimson, banking elegantly toward them. Keller clenched his jaw. "Da Cincy," he whispered. "There they are." The battle erupted like thunder. Cannon shells tore through the air, tracer lines weaving chaos through the sky. Keller's first pass was clean. He dove through a bomber formation, firing at a B-17's engines. But before he could pull up, 2 Mustangs swooped down, their synchronized attack forcing him into a desperate roll. He felt the rattle of bullets striking his right wing and cursed. "Schieße! Die sind überall!" he shouted into the radio. Around him, the sky burned. One of his pilots tried to climb, but was cut down by a burst from Harmon's guns. Another tried to dive, but was hunted relentlessly by Lewis himself, who fired short, precise bursts until the Messerschmitt exploded into a rolling fireball. The dogfight raged for 20 minutes that felt like hours. The Redtails moved with inhuman discipline, no reckless dives, no showmanship. Every move was calculated, protective, united. Keller tried to break away, diving beneath the bombers to regroup, but a Mustang followed him through the clouds. He twisted, pulled up sharply, then rolled over, only to see the red flash still behind him. He had never seen pursuit flying like this. The pilot behind him was matching every motion perfectly, as if reading his thoughts. Then, the tracer rounds lit up his canopy. Keller pulled away just in time, his aircraft grazing a treetop before leveling out. The Mustang didn't chase, it returned upward, protecting the bombers again. That small gesture, mercy, or perhaps discipline, humiliated Keller more than being shot down would have. When the surviving German planes limped home, Keller's base was half in ruins. Too many empty bunks, too many wrecks. The mechanics worked silently, their faces pale. The once cocky pilots avoided each other's eyes. They had lost 12 aircraft to what intelligence confirmed were Redtail's escorts. For the first time, Keller didn't even bother with excuses. "They are the best we've faced," he admitted to his commanding officer. "Not just good, different." The officer sneered, unwilling to accept defeat. "They're Americans, Keller. Colored Americans. Do you understand what that means?" Keller's eyes were cold. "Yes," he said quietly. "It means they fly better than we do." Back at Ramitelli, the Redtails returned to applause. The bombers they escorted had suffered no losses. Commanders congratulated them, and photographers took pictures of the crimson Mustangs glinting against the afternoon sun. But Lewis, standing beside his aircraft, didn't celebrate. He knew the war wasn't over. Each success only made them a bigger target. That night, as he sat with his squadron around a fire, he told them, "Remember what our grandfather said. When they doubt you, work harder. When they fear you, fight smarter. And when they hate you, keep flying higher." His men nodded, knowing that tomorrow the sky would call again. Far away in a dim Berlin bunker, intelligence officers studied combat reports, trying to make sense of how a single American squadron could inflict so much damage. Some claimed it was superior aircraft. Others said it was sheer luck. But the truth, though few dared to say it out loud, was simpler. Discipline, unity, and the unyielding will of men who had everything to prove. The Redtails had become more than pilots. They were a symbol, and for Keller and the Luftwaffe, that symbol was quickly turning into a nightmare painted in red. The weeks that followed became a quiet storm brewing within every German airbase still capable of launching sorties. The skies that once belonged to the Luftwaffe were turning hostile, not because of sheer numbers, but because of the red flashes that appeared whenever bombers crossed into enemy territory. The Redtails had become an omen. Pilots spoke their name in low voices, as if saying it too loud would summon them. Major Franz Keller, still recovering from his last engagement, stood before a group of fresh recruits in the briefing hall. His eyes were hollow, his tone heavy with truth. "You've heard the stories," he began, pacing slowly. "You think they're exaggerated, that no American unit could fly like that. I thought the same, until I met them." He stopped, glancing at the photograph projected on the wall, a P-51 Mustang with a crimson tail, sunlight gleaming off its polished skin. "They're not legends," Keller said quietly. "They're real, and they don't make mistakes." As the recruits murmured nervously, Keller turned toward the map showing Allied bomber routes. The Americans are hitting our fuel depots, our supply chains, our factories. Without fuel, our Messerschmitts are just metal carcasses. That's what the Red Tails protect, the arteries that feed this war. If we can't stop them, the Reich will suffocate." His commanding officer, Colonel von Brecht, interrupted sharply. "Then stop them, Keller. I didn't bring you back from the hospital to admire them." The room fell silent. Keller met his superior's glare and replied, "I'll do my duty, but understand this, we're not fighting machines, we're fighting belief." That same dawn, at the Allied airfield in Ramitelli, Italy, the Red Tails were already in motion. The engines of their P-51 Mustangs growled like lions caged too long. The men had grown used to early mornings, briefing, strategy, faith, and flight. Captain Daniel "Lucky" Lewis gathered his pilots under the open sky, his voice steady. "Intelligence says the Luftwaffe's desperate. They're sending what's left of their aces from Germany and Hungary. That means more skill, more risk, but you know our rule, no bomber gets left behind." The squadron nodded in unison, their faces calm, every man aware that the sky was both their stage and their graveyard. Lewis turned toward his crimson Mustang and whispered to himself, "Let's paint the heavens red again." The mission that day was to escort bombers to Regensburg, a critical strike on German aircraft factories. It was deep inside enemy territory, heavily defended by radar and anti-aircraft guns. As the bombers climbed to altitude, the Red Tails took their formation, tight, symmetrical, and silent. The sky above the Alps was clear, the sun burning pale gold on the horizon. Lewis led the vanguard. Harmon flew on his right wing, sharp and fearless as always. Hours passed in tense anticipation until their radios crackled, multiple contacts bearing 11 o'clock high, fast movers. Lewis's eyes narrowed. Here they come. The German squadron descended in formation, slicing through the clouds like hawks. Keller led them again, his Messerschmitt painted in faded camouflage, its nose marked with kill symbols, each one representing an enemy downed before the Red Tails had arrived. But now those marks felt like relics. He looked up, and there they were, crimson flashes against the silver bombers, cutting across the blue like fire. His radio buzzed with voices, young, anxious pilots calling out targets. "Maintain formation," Keller ordered. "We attack in waves, not chaos." Then the world erupted. The Red Tails broke off from the bombers and climbed into the oncoming storm. The sky filled with cannon fire, tracer rounds, and vapor trails. Lewis banked hard, catching a Messerschmitt diving toward a B-17. He fired a short burst. Metal shreds exploded from the enemy's wing. "That's one less," he muttered. But there was no time to celebrate. The air was alive with death. Harmon shouted over the radio, "Two on my tail." Lewis spun his Mustang around in a violent turn, pulling high G's until his vision blurred, then dove down behind the Germans. He fired once, clean, efficient, and one enemy burst into flame. Harmon pulled free, his laughter echoing through static. "Thanks, Lucky. Owe you one." Meanwhile, Keller's squadron was falling apart. His young pilots, untested and terrified, were no match for the Red Tails' discipline. He saw one of his men panic and break formation, only to be torn apart by crossfire. "Stay together," Keller roared, but it was too late. The Red Tails had divided them, cutting through their ranks like a blade. Keller's instincts took over. He dived toward the bombers, hoping to at least cripple one before retreating. As he lined up his shot, something caught his eye. A crimson Mustang approaching head-on. He fired, missed. The Mustang didn't flinch. It came closer, steady, fearless. Keller's finger trembled on the trigger. In that split second, he recognized the number on its side, the same pilot who had spared him weeks before. Lewis. Their eyes met through glass and wind. two warriors from different worlds, bound by the same sky. Lewis banked left, then rolled into a perfect vertical climb. Keller followed instinctively, too fast, too sharp. He felt his plane shudder under the strain. At the top of the loop, Lewis inverted, came down behind him and fired a 3-second burst. Keller's Messerschmitt jolted violently. Flames erupted from the fuselage. He pulled the canopy lever, fighting to eject. As he parachuted through the smoke, he watched his plane spiral into the valley below. His pride, his years of dominance, vanishing into the forest. When the Red Tails returned, the bombers were intact, every aircraft accounted for. Another perfect escort. The base erupted in cheers, but Lewis said little. He walked alone to the hangar, staring at the horizon. He didn't know that the pilot he had downed had survived. He only knew that something inside him had shifted. It wasn't triumph, it was understanding. Up there in the sky, he hadn't just beaten an enemy, he had faced another man's truth. Keller, meanwhile, lay in a German field hospital, his body bruised, his spirit hollow. His commander visited briefly, delivering the same speech about honor and duty, but Keller wasn't listening. He stared out the window, watching smoke from burning fuel depots rise into the gray sky. He whispered to himself, "They own the heavens now." For the first time, he understood what defeat truly meant, not losing ground, but losing belief. As the Red Tails continued their missions, news of their unmatched record spread across Europe. Over 100 kills and 0 bombers lost under their watch. German intelligence tried to dismiss it as propaganda, but in the mess halls and barracks, no one laughed anymore. The crimson-tailed Mustangs had become the ghostly executioners of the skies. Even the most decorated aces avoided missions near their routes. For men like Keller, their legend was now carved in fear. And for Lewis and his men, it was carved in purpose. The war in the air had changed forever. No longer was it about domination or ego. It was about endurance, unity, and something that even bullets couldn't destroy: respect earned through fire and faith. As the Red Tails prepared for their next mission, Lewis looked over the row of crimson Mustangs gleaming in the sunlight and murmured, "Let them come again. The sky remembers who owns it." The winter of 1944 deepened, and with it, the final pride of the Luftwaffe began to crumble. Once a symbol of unstoppable air power, the German squadrons now operated under the shadow of exhaustion, desperation, and disbelief. The Red Tails had become a curse whispered among pilots, the crimson ghosts who could appear from the sun and vanish into clouds, leaving fire behind. Their precision, their unity, their courage, it was unlike anything the German airmen had faced before. Major Franz Keller, bandaged and pale, sat in a dim operations room with maps spread before him. He was no longer the confident ace who mocked the idea of black American pilots being equals in the air. He was a man haunted by memory, the glint of red tails reflecting off his shattered canopy, the hum of a Mustang's engine echoing in his dreams. The Luftwaffe command was desperate now. Supplies were scarce, fuel nearly gone, and pilots were dying faster than replacements could be trained. Yet orders kept coming. Intercept, destroy, do not retreat. Far away, in Italy, the Red Tails were preparing for what would become their most dangerous series of missions yet: deep penetration bomber escorts into the heart of Germany. At the Ramitelli airfield, Captain Daniel "Lucky" Lewis stood beside his P-51, running a hand along the smooth red paint. His mechanic, Jenkins, tightened the last bolts near the propeller, his face streaked with oil. "You really think we'll make it to Berlin and back, Captain?" Jenkins asked. Lewis smiled faintly. "If the engines hold, and our faith stays strong, we'll make it." Around them, the squadron moved with disciplined rhythm, checking oxygen masks, cleaning canopies, loading ammunition belts. The hum of activity felt almost sacred now. Every man knew what the red tails represented, not just to their country, but to history itself. They were fighting for a world that often doubted their worth and proving it wrong in every mission. At dawn, the engines roared to life, echoing across the Italian plains. The red tails lifted into the air in perfect formation, their mustangs gleaming like molten metal under the sun. The mission objective was Augsburg, a major aircraft assembly facility critical to Germany's last-ditch air production. Intelligence warned of heavy opposition, flak batteries, experienced German interceptors, and ground radar ready to vector fighters the moment bombers were detected. Lewis took point, his voice calm over the radio. "Stay tight, Red Squadron. We're flying into history today." The silence that followed was heavy, respectful. They climbed higher, breaking through the cloud layer until the world below turned into a gray sea. Meanwhile, in southern Germany, Keller climbed into the cockpit of a rebuilt Messerschmitt Bf-109. His body still ached from his injuries, but his spirit burned with one last sense of duty. Around him, younger pilots prepared their aircraft. Boys barely 20, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and reverence. He addressed them before takeoff. "Listen to me. The enemy you're about to face is disciplined, fearless, and united. You will be tempted to fight with rage. Don't. Fight with purpose. Fly as one." He paused, then added quietly, "And if you see the red tails, remember, they've earned the sky. You'll have to take it back." The men nodded, though none truly believed they could. As Keller's engine growled to life, he whispered into his mask, "Let the fates decide." By midday, the bombers were over German territory. Black clouds of flak burst around them, shaking the air. The red tails weaved in protective circles, their crimson tail streaking through the chaos. "Bandits, 3 o'clock high!" shouted Harmon. Dozens of Messerschmitts dove from above, sunlight flashing off their wings. The sky erupted in war. Tracers cut through vapor trails, engines screamed, and the sound of gunfire was swallowed by the wind. Keller led the first attack, diving straight toward the bomber formation, cannons blazing. The red tails broke off from escort position to intercept, climbing in tight synchronization. Lewis pulled up hard, looping over a diving German fighter, then rolled inverted to meet it head-on. Their bullets crossed like threads of light. Keller's wingman exploded in mid-air, debris spinning away like shattered glass. "They're everywhere!" a young German pilot cried over the radio. "Hold formation!" Keller barked, but his command was drowned by static and chaos. Harmon and Jenkins were flying wing to wing, chasing down 2 enemy planes that had broken through. "Cut them off before they reach the bombers!" Harmon yelled. He lined up his shot, waited for the perfect angle, and fired. One Messerschmitt disintegrated instantly. The second tried to dive, but Jenkins closed in, pressing his trigger until his guns clicked empty. The German aircraft burst into flames and plunged toward the forest below. "2 down," Jenkins said through clenched teeth. "Good work," Harmon replied, pulling his Mustang into a climb. Above them, Lewis found himself once again face to face with Keller. They recognized each other instantly, even through the glass, even through the distance. The dance resumed, not of hate, but of fate. They spiraled upward in a deadly waltz, engines howling as they climbed through flak bursts. Keller fired a burst that grazed Lewis's wingtip, tearing metal but not resolve. Lewis countered with a dive, pulling behind Keller, matching every maneuver with surgical precision. "You can't shake him!" Keller's comrade shouted over the radio. "Break away!" But Keller ignored the voice. He wanted this duel to end in truth, not retreat. Lewis held steady, waiting, patient as ever. When Keller tried to roll, his damaged plane lagged, and that moment of hesitation was enough. Lewis squeezed the trigger. Bullets tore through the Messerschmitt's engine. Smoke erupted, flames trailing in the cold air. Keller didn't eject this time. He held the stick firm, the ground rushing up toward him. In his final seconds, he looked through the canopy at the red-tailed Mustang above him and smiled faintly. "Worthy enemies," he whispered, before the world turned white. Lewis watched the smoke plume rising from below and felt no victory, only the quiet ache of respect. The Redtails regrouped, their bomber still intact, and turned for home. As they crossed the Alps, the sunlight caught their crimson tails, making them glow like streaks of fire across the sky. When they landed at Ramitelli, the airfield erupted in cheers. Another mission completed, another record untouched, no bombers lost. Yet for Lewis, the silence afterward weighed heavy. He knew they had broken more than enemy squadrons. They had broken a legacy of arrogance and disbelief. The Redtails had forced even their enemies to see their worth. In Germany, word of Keller's death spread quietly. The Luftwaffe officers saluted his bravery, but even they knew it marked the end of an era. The once mighty Air Force was now running on fumes, while the Redtails soared freely over Europe. The Crimson Wings had become symbols, not just of skill, but of endurance, unity, and the victory of those who had been told they could never belong. By the time night fell over Ramitelli, Lewis sat alone beside his Mustang, looking at the stars reflected on its polished body. He thought of Keller, of all the men who had fallen on both sides, of how war forced strangers to become mirrors of one another. "We proved them wrong," he murmured softly, "but at what cost?" Above him, the Italian sky was vast and silent, holding the memories of countless battles. And somewhere in that darkness, the ghosts of fallen pilots, both German and American alike, drifted together, their stories intertwined forever. The winter of 1945 crept in like a weary soldier, cold, bruised, and heavy with the scent of finality. Europe was crumbling under the weight of its own war, and the sky, once dominated by the thunder of German engines, now belonged to the Allies. The Redtails had carved their legend into the clouds, their crimson fins now a promise that no bomber would ever fly alone. At Ramitelli Airfield, the dawn began quietly, the kind of silence that comes before history moves again. Captain Daniel "Lucky" Lewis walked across the frost-covered tarmac, his flight jacket zipped tight, his breath rising in white plumes. Around him, ground crews worked in rhythm, the metallic hum of maintenance tools filling the air. The P-51 Mustang stood ready, red tails gleaming against the gray morning light, wings dusted with frost that glimmered like diamonds. For Lewis, every morning felt like a prayer answered, that his men were still alive, that their courage still outshone the hatred that had built the world's greatest war. Inside the mess tent, laughter echoed, tired, raw, but real. Lieutenant Harmon sat with a steaming mug of coffee, flipping through a tattered newspaper. The headline read, "Redtails continue perfect record. No bombers lost under their protection." Jenkins leaned over his shoulder, grinning. "Would you look at that? We're front-page heroes now." Harmon smirked. About time the world noticed. Lewis entered then, his presence immediately commanding the room's attention. "Enjoy the fame, boys, but don't let it get to your heads. The next mission's always the hardest." The men nodded. They knew he was right. Glory was temporary, but legacy, that was something forged mission by mission, in sweat, steel, and faith. Outside, a jeep rolled in from command headquarters, bringing an officer with new orders. The men gathered around as the document was unfolded. The target was Berlin, the heart of the Reich itself. The mission was to escort B-17 bombers on one of the longest, most dangerous flights of the war. The Luftwaffe's last stand was expected. "Berlin," Jenkins whispered. "We're flying straight into the lion's den." Lewis's jaw tightened, but his eyes didn't waver. "If Berlin is where this ends, then we end it flying." The order was given, wheels up at 0500. The Redtails dispersed, preparing for what they all knew could be their final mission. That night, the base was unusually still. Some pilots wrote letters home, others cleaned their gear in silence. Lewis sat outside his tent, staring at the distant glow of flares across the Italian horizon. Harmon joined him, sitting quietly for a moment before speaking. "You ever think about what happens after all this?" Lewis chuckled softly. "After this war, maybe I'll open a flying school. Teach kids what the sky feels like when it's free." Harmon smiled. "You? A teacher?" Lewis nodded. "Why not? We've already taught the world something they'll never forget." Harmon's face turned serious. "You mean that men like us can fight as hard, fly as just as high?" Lewis looked up at the stars and said, "No, Harmon, I mean that courage doesn't wear a color, it wears wings." The next morning, the engines of 50 P-51 Mustangs roared awake, shaking the earth beneath their wheels. The red tails formed up in the sky, their formation so precise it looked choreographed. The bombers climbed ahead of them, massive silhouettes cutting through the thin air. Lewis's voice came over the radio, calm and commanding. "Red Squadron, this is Lucky 1. Keep formation tight, eyes sharp. Today we make history." The sun broke over the horizon, and for a moment the sky looked aflame, streaks of red and gold glinting off every tail and wing. The mission had begun. As they crossed into German airspace, flak erupted around them, dark blossoms of smoke filling the sky. The radio crackled with frantic chatter from bomber crews. "We're taking heavy fire, 2 engines down." Lewis's voice cut through the chaos. "Stay on course, we've got your backs." The red tails dove into the storm of gunfire, weaving between black bursts of smoke, their propellers slicing through shrapnel-filled air. Then came the warning, radar contacts, dozens of them closing fast. "Enemy fighters inbound, 12 o'clock high," shouted Harmon. From above the clouds a swarm of Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitts descended like dark angels. The last strength of the Luftwaffe was being thrown into the fight. The sky became a storm of motion and fury. German fighters broke into attack runs, cannons blazing, while the red tails met them head-on. Jenkins took the first kill, his bullets tearing through a Focke-Wulf 190's fuselage. Harmon followed, catching another in a tight roll before blasting it apart. "2 down," he called out. "Plenty more where that came from," Lewis replied, banking hard to engage a pair trying to flank the bombers. The radio filled with screams, orders, and static. It was chaos, but in that chaos, the red tails moved like one living being, each pilot anticipating the other's move. They weren't just fighting, they were dancing with death. Lewis caught sight of a formation of German fighters diving toward the bombers. He pulled back the throttle, flipped into an inverted dive, and came down on them from above. His guns roared, and 2 planes disintegrated in flame. He could see the faces of the German pilots for a brief moment, boys not much older than his own crew. For every enemy downed, he felt the weight of another soul lost to the madness of war. "Hold your lines, Red Squadron. We don't lose anyone today," Lewis commanded. Then came the most surreal sight of the war. Mid-battle, as the sky burned with tracer fire, 2 crippled aircraft, one German, one American, spiraled downward side by side. Both pilots ejected, their parachutes opening near each other. As they drifted down, their eyes met. Enemies a moment ago, now just men suspended between heaven and earth. That image stayed with everyone who saw it, a reminder that beneath the flags and fury, they were all the same. By the time the last enemy fighter broke away, the red tails had once again done the impossible. The bombers were intact. The Luftwaffe's last push had failed. Over the radio came the trembling voice of a bomber pilot. "God bless those red tails. We wouldn't be alive without them." The red tails turned homeward, their fuel low, their hearts heavy but proud. The smoke trails behind them looked like ribbons against the sky, crimson and white twisting together, symbols of unity forged through fire. When they landed back at Ramatelli, there was no celebration. The air was too heavy with the weight of what they'd seen. Lewis climbed out of his Mustang, exhausted, his face streaked with sweat and grime. Harmon ran up, grinning despite the fatigue. "We did it, Captain. Berlin's still smoking." Lewis nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said softly. "And the sky's still ours." He looked at his men, tired, scarred but alive, and felt an overwhelming surge of gratitude. They had entered the war as outsiders, doubted by their own country, mocked by their allies, dismissed by their enemies. But they had emerged as legends, warriors whose courage couldn't be denied. That night, as the last lights at Ramitelli flickered out, Lewis sat on the wing of his Mustang, staring into the endless darkness above. Somewhere in that vast expanse, the spirits of every fallen pilot, friend and foe, drifted together, their echoes carried by the wind. And in that silence he whispered, "We didn't just fight to win the war. We fought to prove we belong in the sky." The stars twinkled faintly above him, as if answering in kind, a celestial salute to the brotherhood of wings that would never be forgotten. The dawn of 1945 came quietly, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Europe was in ruins, cities reduced to ashes, forests scarred by bomb craters, and rivers flowing thick with the debris of broken empires. But high above that shattered earth, the red tails still flew, painting the sky with their crimson signature. They had survived the storm, defied the odds, and rewritten history in the language of courage. For Captain Daniel "Lucky" Lewis, the war had become something deeper than victory or defeat. It was a mirror of everything men were capable of, both noble and terrible. At the Ramitelli airfield he stood before his squadron for what everyone knew would be their last mission together. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice firm but calm, "we fought our fight, proved our worth, and earned our place in history. But this sky, our sky, still calls us one more time." The men stood in silence, every face hardened by experience yet softened by pride. They were no longer the boys who had once been doubted, mocked, and dismissed. They were aviators, brothers forged in the crucible of war. Their orders were simple: one final escort mission, ensuring that the last Allied bombers crossed safely into Austria and back. Intelligence suggested little resistance left in the air, but everyone knew that desperation made even dying enemies dangerous. Harmon, leaning against his Mustang's wing, said with a grin, "Just another milk run, huh?" Jenkins laughed, shaking his head. "That's what they said last time." Lewis smiled faintly as he climbed into his cockpit, the smell of oil and gunmetal oddly comforting. "Let's bring every man home," he said over the radio as engines roared to life. The red tails taxied down the runway in perfect symmetry, lifted off into the bright Italian morning, and formed their familiar arrow in the sky. The flight began peacefully. The bombers ahead flew steady and slow, their contrails stretching across the blue like threads of silk. The red tails weaved above and around them, eyes scanning the horizon. Below, the Alps gleamed white, majestic, and indifferent to the destruction men had waged beneath them. Lewis looked down at the mountains and thought of Keller, the German ace who had once sworn to reclaim the skies, but instead had found redemption in defeat. Lewis had no hate for him now, only understanding. Every man who flew had carried a dream, and war had stolen most of them. But as long as he lived, he would honor those dreams, his own and his enemies. An hour into the mission, static broke the calm. "Contact! Multiple bogies at high altitude, bearing east!" Harmon's voice was sharp. Lewis's heart quickened. "Stay focused," he ordered. "We finish what we started." Out of the sun came a formation of Fokker-Wolfs, a ghost squadron, worn and battered but still defiant. They descended fast, desperate, engines howling as if fueled by vengeance itself. The red tails broke into defensive formations instantly. "Here they come!" Jenkins shouted. The sky erupted in chaos once again. Tracer rounds streaked across the air, bombers shuddered under flak bursts, and Mustangs dove to intercept. Lewis rolled his Mustang into a tight loop, firing at a German fighter cutting toward the bombers. His bullets tore through its tail, sending it spinning into the abyss. But more kept coming. Harmon's voice crackled. "2 on my 6!" Lewis spun his Mustang around, climbing steeply, then dove into the fray. He caught one enemy in his sights and squeezed the trigger. The plane exploded in a brilliant bloom of flame. "Clear," he called. Harmon pulled free, his laughter raw but relieved. "You're still the luckiest man alive, Lucky." Lewis smiled through gritted teeth. "Luck's just another word for faith." But fate, it seemed, had one more test to give. From the clouds above, another Messerschmitt dropped down, guns blazing, riddling Jenkins' Mustang with bullets. "I'm hit," Jenkins shouted, smoke pouring from his engine. Lewis saw the fire, the twisting plane losing altitude. "Bail out, Jenkins, now!" Jenkins' canopy flew open, and a white parachute blossomed against the blue. The men watched as his burning Mustang crashed into the snow-covered valley below. For a moment, the radio was silent, the kind of silence that breaks something deep inside. Rage burned in Lewis's chest, but it wasn't blind fury. It was clarity, cold and righteous. "Red Squadron," he said quietly, "for Jenkins." The Red Tails turned into the wind, their formation slicing upward like a blade. They charged into the enemy formation, firing with precision born from purpose. One after another, German fighters fell, engines torn apart, wings ripped to shreds. The air was thick with smoke, fire, and vengeance. Even the bomber crews below watched in awe as the Red Tails dismantled the enemy with unshakable grace. By the time the battle ended, no German aircraft remained. The Red Tails had ended the Luftwaffe's reign for good. When the bombers finally crossed safely into Allied airspace, the Red Tails regrouped. The air was calm again, eerily peaceful. Lewis glanced over his shoulder at the empty spot where Jenkins' plane should have been. He exhaled slowly, then spoke into the radio. "Mission accomplished, boys. Let's go home." The words hung heavy, victory and loss intertwined. As they descended back toward Ramitelli, the horizon glowed gold with sunset. The red tails of their Mustangs shimmered in that light, like torches guiding the world toward dawn. Back at base, the men climbed out of their planes in silence. No one cheered. They had won, but the cost of victory had etched itself too deep. Lewis stood beside his aircraft watching the medics report that Jenkins had been found alive, but injured, rescued from the snowy valley by advancing Allied troops. The relief was immense, but quiet, like a prayer answered softly. Later that evening, the squadron gathered around a bonfire, their faces lit by the flickering glow. Harmon raised a mug and said, "To the Red Tails, to the men who never turned back and the friends who never fell alone." The group echoed him, voices trembling with pride and grief. As weeks turned into months, the war in Europe ended. Germany surrendered. The Luftwaffe's mighty eagles were grounded forever. And the Red Tails, their mission complete, were finally sent home. When Lewis stepped off the transport ship onto American soil, he expected fanfare, but instead found silence. Their achievements, though monumental, were buried beneath the prejudice of the time. But he smiled, because he knew that history, though slow, always catches up with truth. He and his men had done the impossible. They had changed the sky, and with it the world's perception of what courage looked like. Their wings, once doubted, had become eternal, symbols of brotherhood, resilience, and the unyielding belief that every man has the right to soar. And so ended the legend of the Red Tails, not with the roar of engines, but with the whisper of memory carried on the wind. The war was over, but their legacy would never land.